I need to calm myself down a bit because I just finished interviewing Renske Visser. She is half of the incredible duo of the Death Studies podcast. And if you have talked to me in the last few months and there was a way for me to insert this podcast into a conversation, I brought it up. I love the Death Studies podcast. I am so grateful that it has been around for almost 5 years, that there are so many episodes that I can listen to because I need them. I need these episodes in my life. It has changed the way that I think about my podcast. It has changed the way that I think about getting back into academia and the plethora, the range of topics around death. I mean, I'm just gobbling it up. Okay, so I just finished my interview with Renske. Renske is, yes, half of the Death Studies podcast. She is also the blogger and the reader behind Dead Good Reading. Sorry, Renske. I got that. It's going to be in the show notes for those those that want to follow along. So if you want to read books of a wide variety of genres and even just realize that death is in books that are not described as death books, you're going to want to check that out. But I don't want to take up too much time. Let's get into the conversation with Renske. You're going to hear all about her work, the things she's done. I'm going to put some links that you can follow and learn more about her because you know what? The conversation is the best part of this. So let's dig in. Let's get Renske on here and you can hear the conversation that we had. I want to share with you. I'm going to actually just jump right in because I feel like you need no prepping to talk about death. So welcome to the show. I've got so many questions for you. But I first want to say how nice it is to be able to get into a conversation with someone and not feel like I have to tiptoe around like the big D, right? Or
You
the big
can dive
G
straight in.
or
Yeah.
any of those. I'm so excited. I just feel so much more like relaxed and like we're gonna have such a natural conversation. So thank you for everything that you do. As someone who is just getting started on this journey of pulling people into these conversations, you have really helped me gain that confidence. And you've also brought me back to academia, which is a place I didn't think I'd ever want to go back to. And now that I can really see the fit, I'm just so excited. And I want to say that one of the things that brought me to your podcast, the Death Studies podcast, was realizing that death is not equal. Like we always say, we all die, it's all the same in the end, but it's really not. There's a lot of injustice around death, there's a lot of differences. And yeah, I have been listening and gobbling up all of your past episodes, and I am anticipating all the future ones. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I hope you'll get the other half of the Dev Studies podcast, Beth Michael Fox, on at some point as well. But I'm delighted to speak with you today.
I hope so too. Thank you. Okay, I would love to know, what was the first death in your life that you realized, living things don't live forever? Was it a pet? Maybe a roadkill? Was it someone in your family? How did you know that death existed? Do you remember?
I do. Well, the death I remember most vividly was the death and the dying of my uncle when I was about 8 years old. So he was from my father's side in relationship with my father's sister, and he was quite a bit older than her, which is a very different conversation. But so he was in his 70s, and he was my favorite uncle. He was also the uncle that would take me to the cemetery because his best friend was buried there, and we would go there and we would water the plants and take care of his best friend's grave. And yeah, so he was at some point diagnosed with a brain tumor. And I was a child. I don't remember all of his care journey and what happened exactly. I do remember he was operated on and he lost quite a lot of his mobility. He was no longer able to open his own eyelids. And he was in a bed, eyes shut, not really being able to move. And I remember at the start of all of this that my parents didn't want me to visit him in hospital. And I remember being livid. And I don't know if I just had a good arguments or who convinced my parents, but at some point I was allowed to visit him, and I remember playing on the floor of his hospital room. And I remember my aunt would tape up his eyes. I don't know what kind, it wasn't duct tape, but some kind of tape, and he would be able to see. And then obviously, because he couldn't blink,
Wow.
that didn't last for a long time. And I remember holding his hand, and he would really squeeze. So I know even when he couldn't see or move, like we had a big connection, and that was still there to the end. And he died on Christmas Eve. Me and my mom and my brother were watching the movie Ghost, which feels very typical.
Yes.
And we received a phone call, and it was my aunt calling, and my dad went to hospital. And we continued watching the movie Ghost, and I still have a very complicated relationship with that film and with Christmas Eve.
Yes.
But yeah, so he was the first person, and I don't know if it's the same where you are from, but in the Netherlands, there is before a funeral, there is a wake, like a set hour where someone is in their coffin and you can visit the body if you want. And I remember having a conversation with my mother, and I wanted to see him because, like, I wanted to visit him in the hospital. I wanted to see him before he was buried. And I had this necklace which was made up of letters of my own name, and I've put that in his coffin. So
Wow.
for archaeologists of the future, if they wonder
Yes.
why these random sets of letters are in his grave, it's my name. And yeah, so I went to his funeral, and I don't know, because people ask me this, like, why did you get interested in researching death and dying? And I do think this experience is part of it, but I also don't think it's like an origin story, but it's always been something that has fascinated me. But I think for me, the dying of my uncle has been a very pivotal point, and also the unfairness of, like, I was dismissed that I'm not allowed to come, but then that changed. And I still feel to this day that I'm still owed a few hospital visits because my parents got to visit more than I did. But it's
Wow. I mean, I can tell just from the way that you shared that story you have either shared it before or you've thought about it. Like it really is such an important thing that happened in your life, not just the loss of someone you loved,
Mm,
but sort of all those little pieces of it, right? Like
yeah.
the unfairness, the urgency, the connection between other elements going on at the same time, the date and time, like all those things, they really do shape how we experience death. And
Mm.
wow.
And
That's
he's also
incredible.
he's buried in the same cemetery as his best friend. In the
Wow.
same, he's like 4 or 5 graves removed from his best friend that we used to
Yeah.
visit when I was small.
Yeah. And what a gift. I don't know if it's common practice
Mm.
to take, children to the cemetery to care for other people's graves, but not where I am. And I think that that's so important because one of the things that I've been learning, I mean, I live in Canada, and so we have a very someone dies, you clean it all up and you just get on and you don't talk about it, and there's not a lot of interaction with the body. And so I've been on this journey to, you know, how does the rest of the world live, and how do
Mm.
we treat the dying, and how do we even treat the dead after they've died? So I just think that's a really beautiful activity that he did with you. Was that something common, or was that unique? Have you found over time?
We've we've done it a few times. I don't, because my uncle was also not
Special?
an ordinary person, so I don't know if it was common for children, but it was definitely something we did.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And so, outside of some of those moments around your uncle's death, can you think of ways that your parents sort of talked about death, treated death, that as you've grown older, you've thought that was very helpful, or I
Mm.
wish it had been different? How did the adults talk about death with you?
I don't actually remember like talking about death and dying that much. I do remember, I don't fully remember what age I was, but my parents went through a phase where they were discussing their own death and then their own means of disposal, as it were. So they were debating burial or cremation, and they went through a phase of visiting different cemeteries in the Netherlands to see if one of them was like the right one for them.
Yeah.
And that was like their weekend activity. I also remember as a child that we would go on a tour of different cemeteries. So maybe the cemetery thing is more
Wow.
common, or it's in my family, but we would visit including my uncle's grave, but visit different cemeteries where relatives were buried. And we would do, like, the Netherlands is quite a small country. So we would do a couple of cemeteries on a Saturday and then we would go home again. But my parents have always, I think also my father never really thought he would live to be that old. His father died before I was born in his early 60s. So my father always said, "Oh, I'm not going to be old." And he
Mm,
was very prepared, I think, to not be. He's turning 75 this year. He's still very much alive.
yeah.
But I think he was always thinking, "Oh, my own father is like the benchmark, and I should prepare to not go older over that." But now he has gone beyond that. But I think my parents have spoken about death and dying a lot. I know my mother. It's mainly funerals. My mother sometimes will be, if there's a music on the radio, she will be like, "Oh, Janis Joplin, Piece of My Heart. I want that played on my funeral." And so there
Yeah.
are Melanie, Beautiful People. I want that played on my funeral. So I know from my mom what she would like. So in that way, it's mainly the burial and the after death part that I think I kind of know what my parents want.
Yeah. Um, have you seen your parents grieve before?
I think with my uncle it was the first
Yeah.
time, but then none of my grandparents are alive anymore. But yeah, that was the first time that I
Yeah.
witnessed it.
Yeah, it's so interesting hearing the differences in how our families kind of shape those early moments, and we don't really even think about it until someone asks or we hear someone else talk about theirs. Um, when did you realize you wanted to be in death studies? Because it wasn't until, a year or two ago I even realized there's like a name for this. There's a name for someone who wants to study death and all the different things around it. Can you take me a little bit through that journey and sort of did you also have this excitement about there's other people like me who want to talk about this and are doing the research?
Absolutely. So I studied anthropology at the University of Amsterdam, and towards the end of my bachelor's, I had to write a bachelor thesis, and then I decided to focus on um, what did I focus on? On like um, rituals and in the Netherlands around funerals and mourning, and because of secularization, we don't do what we used to do, and did we ever do that fully? But there's, I think, a lot of needs for ritual, and I find it very forced that, or at least at the time, that you funerals have to be personal, because I think also in times of of grief and loss, I think a lot of people are very comfortable if there's like, this is the handbook, off you go.
Yeah.
But in the Netherlands, very much do it your own way, personalization. And that was the first time I was really focusing on deaf and dying in the Netherlands. Obviously, anthropology as a discipline, a lot of traditional ethnographers have looked at funeral rituals elsewhere and how other people do it. And I was very much interested. It's not looking at the other, but like, what are we doing? Like, even this conversation today, we are both in what are quote unquote Western countries, but we'll do things so differently. So I was very much interested in, yeah, what do we do in the Netherlands? And even I didn't know deaf studies was a thing until like a few years into researching deaf and dying. But what do people do? And in books, when they talk about Western attitudes, what does that mean? Because also with the Netherlands having a euthanasia law, there are very different ways of thinking about death and dying. But I also remember in my undergraduate group, we had this support group for our thesis, and one of the other women in my group did not want to talk about my topic.
Wow.
She thought it was morbid, and she didn't. We were supposed to be each other's support group, but she did not want to be my support.
Wow.
I don't even remember what she was studying, but Yeah, so even there was some pushback, and I did my master's in Amsterdam as well, and then I moved to the UK to Bath, and I did my PhD with the Center for Death and Society, and that was the first time where I thought, oh, I've met my people, and
Yeah.
oh, I'm not the only weirdo doing death, but it's there's more of us.
Yeah. So what has that meant to you over the last few years? Really, having your community and having these spaces. I mean, you and Beth have interviewed people all over the world in very specific niche topics related to death. I just finished listening to your episode where you were at the DDD conference, where I cannot wait to go. Like, I'm like,
Mhm.
oh no, a whole almost 2 years I gotta wait, but I just like the feeling of being around, hundreds of people who are just like in it with you. What has that meant to you in your own personal life and also in your studies and your authorship and things like that?
Mm. I think the dev studies community is very welcoming and very like DDD was also catching up with people I haven't seen for a few years or meeting certain people in the flesh. But I think, and I don't know if every kind of field says this, but there is a support and a welcoming and a generosity, listening to people's ideas. I think there's not as much ego as in certain other fields, or there's also not as much to gain, I think, or but it's been very nice, and it's also nice to see like people doing their PhDs now too, that I still like the way you introduced me. It's like, oh, people get something out of the things that I do. So I really enjoy being a part of that community. It's also a field of studies, depending on where you live. There's not that many jobs in it. So also the podcast Beth and I do is very much at this point in time a labor of love and not a source of income. But it's as you can see from our podcast, from DDD, from all kinds of conferences, death is such a broad topic. People do very specific things in it, and it's still evolving and growing. And I really enjoy how much it is growing and how much it's coming out of the shadows. There are still, I think, topics that are a bit more, I don't like the word taboo, but a bit more taboo or not as researched as much. And also there's just a shift in ways of thinking about death and dying that I really enjoy being a part of.
Yeah, is there some topics, in the last little while or even along the way where you sort of had this moment? Like for me, it was I was having this conversation with someone who holds memorials for those who have died on the street, unhoused
Mm.
people. And we had this conversation and, she was talking about, yeah, like if you're not within connection with your family, if you're living on the street, you might not know when your sister dies. They might not know when you die. You are
Mm.
also witnessing perhaps your friends dying while you're also trying not to die. And it was such it's obvious, like as she was saying it, I wasn't like, I don't know. I was like, oh my God. Like I had this moment where I was like, yeah, death is not an equalizer. So that was a big moment for me where I was like, I have to start seeing like all the injustices that we have here in our living lives, they carry with us to the grave and beyond. And I'm sure in some of your research, we even, bring those lives back out in ways now that there's like AI and things like that. And there's so much like ethics around it and democracy around it. Was there something or is there a topic where you just feel like really fierce and passionate about it and you feel like people need to think about this when it comes to death? Or is that
I
is
think
that too much of a question?
no, I love the question. It's also because within Dev Study, I've done a bunch of different projects. I don't really
Yes.
have one clear focus of this is what I'm interested in, but I do think it's really important that we look at marginalization and death and dying. So I did a project on cancer care in prison, and people dying in prison do not die the same way as people who live in the community, and then also people in prison, depending on where they are around the world. And I think in particularly, and I would love to do more work on that in the future, but to remember that people in prison are indeed people who
Yes.
are entitled to a nice death and to a humane death. And yeah, that is something that I think, and I know some people are doing wonderful work around that topic, but it's even though things like your opening question, like when do you first encounter death and dying, I think still there is lots and lots we can do around children and death and dying. And it's a project I'm involved with now, explicitly focusing on childhood and death. And I've done a bit of a literature research, and it's very limited what has been done with children, or it's very much in the we need to protect children. We
Mm,
need to
yeah.
explain what grief is or preempt that they will be upset instead of why don't we listen to what children have to say, what questions they ask? And it's okay if we don't have answers, but to just have that conversation.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be prescriptive, it doesn't have to be the final answer. But I think there is so much, especially now, children growing up with war, climate change, extinction, genocide, famine, all of those things. We need to have conversations with our children. And also children are dying. So it's
Yeah.
something that I think is very much relevant and not as much researched as can be.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said everything everything you just said because I think, it's coming from Canada, coming from the West, you know, we are very fortunate to have, I mean, I grew up here. I have not seen murder. I have not seen war. I have not, but I have neighbors, I have friends, and they've come from those countries where they left to get away from that and to save themselves. And so just this idea that, you know, I can't remember when it was. It was a couple of years ago where, I had been really focusing on death as this natural progression from life to the end. And sometimes there's an illness and that's really tragic. But really kind of, even though my background is political science, peace and conflict studies, I'm very much, if I can pick up a sign and protest something, I'm going to do it. But I had found it very tricky to figure out, how do I talk about death and dying, and also these big things you just talked about, genocide, right?
Mm.
Yes, we're all dying, but we also shouldn't be murdered, right? And so I've had a tricky time sort of wanting to start out with a podcast where let's just see if people will talk to me about death and maybe it'll inspire them to live a good life. And then also having this like huge thing on my shoulder, which is like, you have to say the thing that you say everywhere else. How have you kind of navigated um, both being a human in this world where a lot is going on? Arguably, if it's always been going on, we just see it a lot more now. But also this, yeah, you're trying to educate people, you're trying to have these academic conversations, and also you're a human being, and the stuff is going to affect you. Um, can you speak a little bit to like how you've worked through that, or how you work through it, or how, Renska, how do you be a human on this planet? That's what we all want to know.
Yeah. Absolutely. I don't know if I have a clear-cut answer for you. I do want to start off by saying is just because I have researched grief, for example, doesn't mean I'm any better at dealing with grief or bereavement in my own personal life. And it will still, if it hits you, there will still be things. And even I, not even I, but I can say the wrong thing to people who are grieving. Like I'm still a human being and we're still learning. And it's not that it's preparing you any better, I feel, than people who are not in deaf studies or researching deaf and dying. I do think sometimes we undermine people's lived experience. So there will be people out there who don't research deaf and dying academically, but who will be much better equipped in dealing with certain things.
Yeah.
But in terms of living in a world where the Trump wants to buy Greenland and what the potential what that can unfold. Like I live in Finland, Russia is our neighbor. There
Yeah.
is the potential for war and conflict every day. And part of me is a bit numb. I think it's just self-protecting as well. It's like I cannot feel everything or be involved in everything, but I've had it since I started studying anthropology, which was a huge eye-opener for me. But anthropology is not a fun discipline because it's basically about power dynamics and people abusing people in different parts of the world. And I've then taken that trajectory to look into death and dying, which is also not a fun topic, but I think I can read certain things academically. I think sometimes I do notice I experience it in my with my thinking brain in my head and not as much with my feelings. So it's even like with DDD and some people being very moved by certain presentations, and sometimes I am as well, but also I just take things. It's the same with watching the news sometimes. It's just okay, yeah, this is horrible, but I'm not emotionally affected right now.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that is, but it's probably, yeah, you can also not be feeling everything or feel responsible for everything, but I do, I think in terms of like helping myself. It's during my working days, going for walks and really listening to podcasts. But then, like I, for example, at the moment have been taking you on my walks, and so it's still death is still in my ears whilst trying to not think about death and dying. So but also it relaxes me because I also have a blog and I read about death and dying for fun as well. Like I really enjoy grief memoirs and I read ethnographies for fun. I'm just a massive nerd, but I there's a lot of stuff for fun that could also be considered, yeah, work in death and dying. So I don't know if this is any help
No,
for
this is
you. And
great. Well, it helps lead into your blog and the books that you share. How did you get into that? Were you just reading the books? Actually, this is a good question. What came first? Dead Good Reading or the Death Studies podcast?
it's about the same time. It's about the same time, and I think it's both are partly also inspired by the pandemic, I think.